So I want to talk to you a little bit about how today's workshop came about. This actually was not in the Cultural Alliance's original plan of work for this year, and we actually have a lot in that plan, but there's an expression that man plans and God laughs, and certainly I think that's been our experience. What we're committed to, though, is to be adaptive to the environment around us. And last fall, there were a couple events that happened in close proximity that really sort of acted as a catalyst or a trigger to this conversation, which was there was a change in staffing at the Philadelphia Inquirer, the reassignment of longtime theater critic Howie Shapiro, at a time that the theater community was coming together to talk about how it should sort of organize for its future with the winding down of the Theater Alliance. So we had that change, and then closely on the heels, a reassignment and a change of format at WRTI around their Creatively Speaking criticism program, which went from long format to short format. Both of those events sort of happened in close proximity and just forced us, I think, to ask some questions about what's going on in the larger environment around journalism. Are there things that are happening that are unique to culture, or are there things that are sort of broader than us that we need to be paying attention to? And I think we got to the answer sort of yes to both, but also that it would be helpful to get some expertise, not just for ourselves, but really for the field as a whole. And that was the catalyst to this panel. And so we reached out to some folks we knew, and they kindly said yes. So I think when we look at these events, we want to view them in the context of what's going on in the media environment, but also in terms of the larger market and technology. And hopefully we'll touch on all those things today. We want to address how the changes in this environment affect the way writers and editors are covering the arts, how cultural consumers are getting their news and information, and how cultural groups can engage with their audiences and the general public in a new way. To help us address these issues, we're delighted to have Doug McLennan, who's the founder and editor of artsjournal.com and the acting director of the National Arts Journalism Program. Doug is someone we've known for a long time. He has written on the arts as a columnist and critic for the Seattle Post-Intelligencer, Salon.com, Newsweek, the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, the Wall Street Journal. These are publications you may have heard of. The London Evening Standard, and NPR's All Things Considered. He's executive director of the Center for Arts, Media, and Audience at USC's Annenberg School for Communications and Journalism, and he's a frequent lecturer on arts and cultural issues. Most importantly, you need to know he's a Juilliard-trained former concert pianist who has performed in North America, Europe, and Asia. So we thought, who better to talk about cultural journalism than a cultural journalist? Please join me in welcoming our featured speaker, Doug McLennan.
Thank you. I sometimes say that when I decided that music was not, trying to be a concert pianist was not the best way to make a living, that I decided that I would go and get rich and get into journalism. So you can see the quality of my career decision making. So please take whatever I say today as with a grain of salt. Also, one caveat, I flew in from Seattle last night after a kind of arduous stop in Minneapolis for 3 hours on a tarmac, and so it's 6 a.m. my time, which is, I assure you, not my best time of the day. So be kind. I think it's thrilling that you're actually having a conversation about arts journalism. As somebody who has been out for the last decade or so trying to raise money for programs for arts journalism, I've gotten so beaten down by this that we actually at USC, we don't actually mention journalism anymore because the journalism funders don't want to fund arts journalism because they think it's kind of backwater, and the arts funders generally don't want to fund journalism because they don't see it as part of the overall structure. They're sort of used to seeing journalism as a kind of if not adversarial role, certainly one to be a little bit wary of. So this is magnificent to see so many people here talking about this. The title of this talk, Plotting the Future, plotting, I love that word, plotting. So I went and looked it up. It says a secret plan or scheme to accomplish some purpose, especially a hostile, unlawful, or evil purpose, a plot to overthrow the government. So I don't know what we'll be hatching up here today. But there is a second meaning for it. And that's called a storyline. A plot is a storyline, of course. And so my role here today is to actually give a little bit of a background for sort of how did we get to the point we are at now, sort of a little history of where we've been. A little bit of a survey to show you what's going on, what people are changing. We're in the midst of a lot of really big changes right now, a lot of upheavals, not just in journalism, not just in the arts, but just across the entire creative fields. And we're about to go into even more turmoil as 3D printers come along and people start making things, and manufacturing becomes democratized in the way that information did in the last decade. So that's the second thing, is that I'll give you a little overview. And then the third is just a few observations of mine as to what I think some of it means, and take, as I said, as I warned you, take it with a grain of salt. So this, of course, is Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, and he articulated the sort of classic idea of what a critic is, the sentinel of the old guard, somebody who is guarding standards, who is setting standards and trying to get other people to meet the standards. I actually think there are a couple of ways of thinking about what arts journalists actually do. One is to define the territory, define what it is that you're going to be talking about. Give a sense of what the shape of that is. Second is you want to walk the perimeter of that and sort of see what everything is. Figure out what the dimensions of it are. And then your job is to really come back, tell us what's new, tell us what's important, and give us some sort of sense of what it might mean. Give us some context. Now, there's another way of thinking about it as well. You could think about it as the need to get the word out, the sort of advertising of culture. I like this one, establish value. When you are discussing something, turning it over, trying to decide what it means, you're actually investing something with value. Art doesn't have power until people decide to do something with it. Right? If nobody pays attention to it, it doesn't have any power. And so this need to define things establishes some value for it. And lastly, to influence taste. It's how people learn. It's how people learn to relate to culture. So, people often talk about a golden age of journalism. And some people point to 50s, 60s, 70s. Maybe to Watergate, as golden age of journalism. Actually, the golden age of journalism maybe in this country was way back in the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s. From the time of the revolution up until about the 1830s, the journalism that was practiced in this country was really, really dry. It was informational. Very, very few people had anything to do with it. It was sold on yearly subscriptions of $4, $5, $6, $7 a year, which sounds really tiny now, but for most people that made it prohibitive. And then something happened in the late 20s, early 30s, which was a technological revolution. There's a technological revolution in the ability to get cheap paper. So suddenly you could print things cheaply. And there was also a revolution in the technology of ink, believe it or not, so that you could print that. And suddenly it became possible to print mass quantities of them. And what we ended up getting was the rise of the penny press. And these newspapers would be sold for 1 penny, 2 penny, 3 penny. In fact, the very first true penny newspaper was produced here in Philadelphia. And concomitant with the rise of these papers, suddenly the journalism became a lot more lively. Whereas before, the journalists actually came out of the printing tradition. They were printers, and they had to fill something up, so they just wrote stuff. Now it was actually writers who started to control things, right? So there was a technological revolution that democratized how people got their information. Sounds a little bit familiar, no? So much so that by the 1860s, New York had 30 newspapers. There was just everybody was publishing a newspaper. And at that point, advertising took over as the means by which journalism got funded from circulation. And it never looked back. Advertising has been the main funder for journalism ever since. Tells you something about where we are. If we want to talk about a golden age of critics, that's an entirely different thing. If you look back to the night, even up in the major cities, the major newspapers all had critics, and they would argue with each other. In the 40s, 50s, when New York City had 17 daily newspapers, you could have a lot of critical back and forth, and there are wonderful collections of reviews and essays from then. But in most cities did not have dedicated critics, or critics who actually specialized, knew what it was they were talking about. Until about the 60s, 70s, when the mid-sized cities around the country started to get critics who were paying attention. As the performing arts and as the visual arts started professionalizing, becoming more businesslike, the press covering it became more businesslike. And so it was pretty common for most cities to have a visual art critic, 3 or 4 critics. Sometimes they did a few things, but this was really kind of the golden age if you're looking at the entire country. But we can't mythologize this too much. As you'll see from this chart, if you go back to the 1860s, you'll see that there was a density of papers, over 4 papers per 100,000. So in a city of 1 million people, you'd have 40 newspapers, right? And that constantly shrank. It consistently shrank until you get to 2008, and it's 0.1 paper per 100,000. That means that there's an awful lot of cities in this country, under 100,000, that don't have anything in terms of daily press. Okay, so as that happened, newspapers around the country in the 70s consolidated, so there was really, most major cities only had one newspaper. And what does that do to critical discourse? You basically got a critic who's talking to himself, right? It becomes a one-sided proposition. And that is not necessarily a healthy thing. It doesn't make for the best kind of criticism. The other thing we have to remember is that traditional journalism has never covered some things very well. Never done a good job of covering dance. There hasn't been a lot of dance coverage. And I can tell you, as somebody who does Arts Journal every day and is out there trolling for dance stories, it's the hardest thing I have to do every day. There are not very many dance stories. It didn't cover community arts very well, never figured out how to do things like participatory arts. There are 250,000 choruses in this country. More than 4 million people sing in a chorus every week. And that never gets reflected in the kind of traditional press. It's easy to see why, but it's something that has not been reflected in a journalistic tradition. And finally, it never did a really good job at looking at alternative cultures in a really kind of serious way. It was very much a kind of top-down, traditional, institutional kind of bias in the way that the arts got covered. And as that happened, and there was more and more pressure on the finances of newspapers, our criticism in the mainstream press became more consumer reports oriented. Should I go to this play? Should I see that movie, right? And it became more and more pop culture oriented. In 2008, at the National Arts Journalism Program, we estimated that 50% of all the staff arts journalism jobs had been lost in the last 8 years. That was a stunning number, and of course, we all know what happened in 2008. All of a sudden, the economy went, and we lost a whole lot more. So we suspect that it's probably 2/3 gone, if not more. Entire cities have gone dark. Places like Minneapolis, St. Paul, with a wonderful arts community, got rid of basically all of its arts reporting staff, and they now have 1, maybe 2 people who a little bit specialized, but it's not their full-time thing. And for a city with a vibrant arts community, this is really, really a problem. And this is happening in communities all over the country. But here's the real truth, okay? This chart actually really says it all. This goes back to 2006, and it looks at revenues for newspapers. And as you can see, print ad sales have plummeted, less than half of what they were. While digital ad has soared, there is now so much supply of digital ad space that it's everywhere. Prices have not come for that ad space, have not anywhere kept up, and newspaper share of it has not grown. And so what this has done is stressed the business model and made it unsustainable for newspapers to perform in the ways that they once did. This is not unusual. It's happened across every creative industry, whether it's music, whether it's television, whether it's movies, print publishing, or, as I said, in journalism. And you can kind of see something in each of these fields that has come along and subverted the business model in some way. It's not just these things, but somebody came along and killed the business model. Even insofar as the Consumer Reports thumbs up, thumbs down, right? Sites like Rotten Tomatoes, which aggregates all critics and gives you an average so you don't have to just trust one person, and sites like Yelp, TripAdvisor, Amazon, the list is on, rate things. And so the pure act of just reviewing things has also fallen out of favor. And in fact, if you talk to people who run culture websites or sites which contain arts journalism on them, they will tell you that the least trafficked stories on those sites are usually the reviews. The most trafficked stories are not the think pieces and the what's it all mean. It's the what's playing, who am I going to see, what am I going to get. It's a completely different thing, not what we expected. This is so cultural journalism has declined, but it's not the only one. All across journalism, it has also declined. And state houses have fewer reporters. City Hall has fewer reporters. There is not the readership for these specialized kinds of journalism that will support it. And now that we can tell who is reading every single thing, it's becoming disaggregated. So we need a new business model. And there have just been one model after another model after another model that people have tried. The most popular one right now that everybody's putting a lot of store in, they hope, is the paywall with meter. You know, how many people subscribe to the Times? Probably a lot, right? And you know, you get 10 free stories, and then after that, you have to pay, and you get a monthly subscription. So it seems to be going well. It seems to be going much better than their previous attempts to lock their columnists away and some of their content. And they actually have a lot of subscribers since they did this last year. In fact, they just reported that they have 640,000, which is pretty good. The circulation in print is only 950, 960, around there. So this is actually pretty decent. Except there's a problem. Because they have a paywall, it means that the total number of eyeballs on their stuff has fallen, which means that their ads, the advertisers are no longer as interested in advertising on them because they're getting to fewer people, right? So for the sixth quarter in a row, circulation revenue has gone up, but ad revenue and total number of eyeballs has gone down, and the two are not counterbalancing. So what was held up as this thing that might save newspapers, it's not a failure yet, but it's got some bumps, right? But here's the other horrifying thing. This was hidden down in about paragraph 20 of the reporting of the Times earnings, because the Times also happens to own the Boston Globe. So they reported how many digital subscribers are now subscribing to the Boston Globe, which went behind a paywall last year. 28,000. And their traffic through the site has just fallen off a cliff. That is a model, ladies and gentlemen, that does not work. Here in Philadelphia, you can still read the paper for free, but we understand that a paywall may be coming. There are a lot of papers now. There are more than 100 now, which just in the last year put paywalls up. And maybe if there's a critical mass, a paywall might happen. But what it does mean ultimately is that information gets traded less and less. We've sort of been in a great age where everybody could see everything, but that might be coming to an end. Okay, so now I want to flip us through a whole bunch of models, just to give you a sense of what people are doing what and how it's going, okay? So you've got one way of approaching this is to throw a hell of a lot of money at it, right? So a couple of the top reporters from the Washington Post and the New York Times a couple of years ago created a site called Politico. Instant hit, but a lot of money was thrown at it. And for right now, it seems to be a success. Huffington Post is probably more well known. It was started in 2005 and was sold in 2011 for $300 million. Now, it has a model which actually has one of the largest news staffs now in the country. They, unlike what is often charged, they actually are paying journalists, and they actually have a lot of journalists that they employ. But more interesting, I think, is that their business model includes very aggressive curating and aggregation. It's this idea that it goes back to the Jeff Jarvis idea, which is an expression I really love, which is do what you do best and link to the rest. And what that essentially means is don't duplicate what somebody's already doing well. One of the bugaboos of traditional journalism is, particularly in markets where there was lots of competition, was that journalists love to believe that what they do is the absolute best and nobody else can do it like they can. So even if somebody else has broken a story, we're going to do it better, right? Which is a great way to do better and better and better and better. But the reality is that there are a lot more of them than there are of you. And if you really want to give the sense of what's happening, it can't just be from your perspective. It's got to be from the perspective of many people. That will always trump it. And most traditional journalism sites, newspapers, still haven't really figured that part out yet. They're still loath to put on their sites things which were written by somebody else. In fact, when I worked at the Seattle Post-Intelligencer, the other newspaper was the Seattle Times, and we were not allowed to write the Seattle Times. We had to use brand X, right? And so there's a sort of switch in mentality that has to happen, where the role of the journalist is as much to give you a sense of the entire context of the land. Who's saying what? What are they saying? Even if I didn't make it, I want to point you there and give you a chance to look at it. And then I can sort of see where it is that I'm the unique way that I'm going to put it together. But believe it or not, that's still not where most traditional journalism is yet. There are a lot are, but many are not. Daily Beast is another one. Daily Beast is such a beast that it actually swallowed Newsweek. Newsweek is no more, but it lives somewhat within the pixels of the Daily Beast. But its cash burn is rather enormous. And if it does not have somebody feeding it lots and lots of money and willing to figure out a model here somewhere, it would not exist. Then there's the root of philanthropy. A group of people were concerned that news organizations were abandoning international coverage, which they did. All of the major networks got out of their bureaus around the rest of the world. CNN got rid of all of its camera people, thought that people could do it on their phones and whatnot. And what did they need to pay cameramen for? And so they got together, raised money, and created this site called Global Post, which does international reporting and which is available for other publications to be able to take up. It's the same idea as ProPublica, which does investigative reporting. It's also 501c3. It's publicly funded. Lest you think that it's not of a quality that traditional press is. Actually, most of its reporters come from the traditional press, and they've actually won 2 Pulitzers, I believe, for their reporting. Then you have a whole series of local or regional publications, which are also sort of quasi-philanthropically funded, but also are a hybrid of memberships. So this is MinPost in Minnesota, run by former journalists laid off by the Star Tribune or who left the Star Tribune. It is funded philanthropically, but it's also a membership site. People buy memberships to it like they do in public broadcasting to help fund the site. And it has broken a number of stories, too. This is Crosscut, which does a similar thing in Seattle, where I'm from. And actually, it started out with angel capital, thought that it would sell ads, thought that it could kind of reinvent this kind of mix of revenues, and about a year ago abandoned all of that and became a purely membership organization, which doesn't just do journalism, but it does events. It has a clubhouse downtown. You can come and hang out with the writers, and there are speakers. So it's become a sort of multi-purpose kind of institution. NPR is a really great model to look at because, NPR is basically free, and it doesn't, quote, have ads, or rather it has ads that work on people who listen to public radio. But most of its funding is from listeners like you, right? A very successful public radio station gets about 9% of its listeners to contribute, which seems shockingly small, except that it actually is enough to be able to fund places like this. So that's another model. And in fact, there are enough traditional print publications now are starting to look at this kind of membership kind of model. In terms of experimenting, the NEA and the Knight Foundation last year had a contest in which they had a couple hundred entries. And one of the winners was from here, the Art Attack Partnership, which funds the creation of arts journalism and embeds it in local media, I think the Daily News. And there are a number of sites that have sprung up in Philadelphia. There's the Broad Street Review, there's Art Blog, Hidden City, a couple celebrity, Fokker. And then around the country, the ones that kind of died out of the gate were those that were funded by, I hate to say it, by the cultural community. Kansas City has one, Boston has one, there are half a dozen of them, and they were alarmed that cultural coverage was sinking, and so they got together and they put some funding together and they started sites. But there's a tension between where the funding comes from and what's being covered and what the criticism is and what the policy is, and it becomes a very difficult dance, which none of them so far have really figured out. And so those that are still alive are really struggling. This, on the other hand, is a site called Glass Tire, which is also a 501c3. But because it's very specific niches, it's down in Texas. It covers Texas, visual art in Texas. And it has been so successful, and it pays its writers, has been so successful that they now have, they've opened a second one in Los Angeles. And say that through advertising and donations, they're actually managing quite well. Adobe Airstream is another one out west. It covers, I think, Santa Fe, Austin, and Denver. A group of visual art writers just got together and, okay, we're going to start defining what it is that we see. It's really beautifully designed. The writing is very variable, but they too pay their writers, and it's now been alive for, 5 or 6 years. Does a very nice job. San Francisco Classical Voice is probably the oldest one. It covers classical music in the Bay Area, started by Bob Commonday, who was a long time music critic there, and he started this when he was like 80-something. It did not look like this. It kind of looked like a bad Craigslist, if you get a picture of that, right? And he was kind of a cranky guy, but he had a very rich friend, a Getty. who gave them some money to do it, and eventually they've transitioned it to being a community site that's supported. They have now a partnership with the local public radio station. There's public radio again. And they actually provide arts coverage for the public radio station. And this kind of partnership, each of them gets something out of it. This is another site, too, which has had identity problems. It used to review everything and discovered that people weren't reading the reviews so much as it was the kind of advances that they liked. But the advances tend to, sometimes they feel sort of critical in the nice sense, the critic's voice. But sometimes too often they feel kind of PR-y. And that's not because they're sucking up. It's because they actually really care about this stuff. And when you're a journalist, when you're an arts journalist, and you really care about this stuff and you see all sorts of threats to it, it's hard not to want to support it. You don't want to do things that will damage it. And that's fundamentally at odds with some of the journalistic impulse. I actually would argue that it isn't, in fact, because it's the journalist impulse to have clean government that causes you to expose corruption in government. And that it might bring it down for the moment, but it actually protects the institution, which is what we should be doing as journalists, but which often doesn't happen. Number of others. Brooklyn Rail, thriving community. Oregon Arts Watch was formed by editors who left the Oregonian. I got to tell you, I read these guys for years in the Oregonian, and I didn't think much of them. They weren't very good. And suddenly they start their own site, and we're getting these long pieces and analysis and and this is like so much better and in-depth than anything they used to do when they were working in traditional press, right? So it can happen. This is a really, really high-quality site. And then you have all sorts of people out there, sort of odd people out there, who are doing things which are kind of reinventing. What? I'm not sure, but this is a woman by the name of Sabrina Artel, who actually, after this, came and was for a year a student at USC, but she started this long before, and she got this little trailer, and what she does is she takes it to the center square of a small town, and she starts baking cookies. And she opens up the trailer and she invites people in to tell their stories. And she's really good at drawing them out. And then she makes radio out of them. And then she syndicated it to a dozen or so stations all over the country. And so she goes from place to place to place. And she started a second site against fracking. She heard so many stories about fracking that she ended up doing something like that. But this is not by any means what you would call traditional journalism. What it is sharing culture. And she does a really interesting job of it. This is a woman who actually goes into galleries and she invites artists to bring in their work, and she does a 60-second review. And she types it out right there, what her reaction is to it, and the artwork hangs next to the review on the wall for the next week. And artists clamor to be in there because what they want is somebody to engage with their work. What she does is engage with their work. And she actually has interesting things to say. It's not about, this is a piece of crap, or this is the best thing I've ever seen. It's engaging with the work in an interesting way. And so she gets instant feedback, they get instant feedback, and it's actually a really kind of interesting relationship. Lest you think that these are all sort of marginal kinds of activities, this is a site called TV Newser, which began about 10 years ago, and quickly, within 6 months of it launching, became the go-to spot for people in the cable news business to find out what was going on in their industry. Everybody read it. It was the go-to site. So imagine their shock when they discovered that it was a 17-year-old boy. Right? When the 17-year-old boy got out of college, he sold the site to Media Bistro for a lot of money and went to work for the New York Times, Brian Stetler. and has become a great big star at the New York Times and has actually invented a new way of doing reporting. Sometimes he'll tweet an entire story as he's doing it. He uses social media to tell his story. And there have been a couple of famous situations where he happened to be traveling somewhere and something dramatic happened, and he figured it out by networking his some 100,000 social media people into finding out the information he needed to have. So this is a phenomenally successful site that still exists. This is a site called Deadline Hollywood, which is likewise the go-to place. If you want to know what all the inside dirt and details and deals and everything about how Hollywood works, this is a woman called Nikki Fink, and she sits in her condo all day. Well, she sold this reportedly a couple of years ago for millions of dollars, and she still runs it, but it's now part of a larger empire, and it has other people working for it. But a very hot property. She gets well compensated for it, and it's a huge success. It actually does a better job than Hollywood Reporter or Variety ever did. Boing Boing is run by 3 people: Cory Doctorow, famous writer, Mark Frauenfelder, and Shani Dardenne. So I know Cory a little bit, and he writes books that he gives away, but he also sells them, and then they become bestsellers, and he makes a lot of money that way. So he's a big proponent of the give everything away, and you'll actually become rich, right? He told me about a year ago that the previous year they had sold about $1 million worth of ads and memberships on here, and split 3 ways after, expenses and everything. It provided a pretty nice income for them. So another really successful model. We all know this guy, right, who was the kind of oracle of the last election. He actually started 538 as a blogspot blogger account, which is, I don't want to say lowest of the low. It's the entry-level blog platform, okay? It's not lowest of the low at all. It's a great platform. But was doing such a great job that the Times hired him. Why is this important? Actually, they didn't hire him. They put him on contract. And he actually brought 538 into the Times. So it's its own separate brand within the Times. And his contract is coming up for renewal in a few months. What do you think he should do? He has the ability to take it away and take it someplace else, which might not be a bad idea for him. He could certainly do it. This is one guy who actually did do it. He started, Andrew Sullivan started his blog as a standalone blog, then went to The Atlantic for a while, then went to Daily Beast for a while, and then just before Christmas announced that he was taking his blog private again. And he now has a staff of 7, I think, that does it. And you pay a membership. And in the space of about a week and a half, he got about $350,000 in memberships. He's up over $500,000 now. And it's basically a voluntary thing. It's like $19. Some of it's hidden behind, some of the content is hidden behind paywalls, but, people are happy to pay more than that. A lot of people pay $100. So that's another successful model. All Things D is one of the great tech blogs, and Walter Mossberg and Kara Swisher, same thing, talk of them taking it. Back to the public radio model. WHYY has picked up arts coverage, and this is not an unusual thing. It picked up some of the Inquirer people. Across the country, this is happening. KERA in Dallas has this very robust site. Denver, Colorado, just got a big grant to, in effect, build a big new arts unit in there. And Bill Kling, the mastermind behind Minnesota Public Radio, NPR, American Public Media, recently said there, a year or so ago, said that he was going to put 100 new reporters in each of, I think it was 5 newsrooms. The idea is that public radio is really on the ascendant here. This is actually one of the bloggers on my site. This is probably the most trafficked arts blog in the country, or actually in the world. It's not in this country. He's in London. Norman Lebrecht is a very well-known music critic in the UK. On a good day, he gets 150,000 people. and he averages maybe 30, 40, 50,000 a day. And he's turned it into a community. On top of that, you got blogs, 300,000 arts blogs, if you take a look. Social media, people are sharing this. Pinterest now is more popular, more users than Twitter. So this stuff keeps evolving. And the next big thing is mobile. Everybody is going to be mobile. Okay? So what to make with all this? And I know I have only like 2-3 minutes. Okay. I can say that in 2 or 3 minutes. 70% of all the content created on the web this year is created by users, not professionals. There's a revolution in the way that people are that content is being created. And for a lot of people now, this is in front of the Mona Lisa. What are they all doing? Looking at the painting, admiring it? No, they're taking pictures. Why? Because for a generation now, cultural experience is not complete until they have the ability to share it. It's how they define themselves. What you curate, what you aggregate, what you send out, it's how you express yourself creatively. And with all of this kind of buzz, and you've got traditional arts organizations which are acting like traditional arts organizations where they want to control their thing, it's not at all actually clear what the role of the traditional institution is going to be. This is Will Wright, who designed The Sims. He created The Sims. And what he discovered was that it was one thing to be able to create something that people would use. It was an order exponentially greater to give them something in which they could express it themselves that unlocks their creativity. What if you thought of journalism as the ability to let people be expressive, creative, in ways in which it's useful to them, in which you help them do that? What if you are an arts organization and you think the same way? In fact, what you do, what your business is not producing product, your business is actually creating structures by which people don't talk back to you, but you connect them up with each other. Is that not what journalism has been? Is that not what culture actually ought to be, right? So it's better to be at the center of a community than it is to be up just telling people what to do. And to get people to make that investment is really important. TED is a great example of that. When they were phenomenally successful, what they did was they released it and they let anybody create their own TED under very strict guidelines. Now there are 500 TED conferences this year. And it's revolutionized the way people share information in that kind of way. Right? And MOOCs are the next thing. Massive open online courses. And colleges, universities are doing these in which they've discovered that it's a much more powerful thing than if a professor just stands up and gives a lecture, sort of like what I'm doing now, instead making it possible for us to unlock all of the hidden value in this room. There are people in this room who know an awful lot more about a lot of the stuff that I've talked about than I do, right? But it's hidden, and not all the pieces come together. So what if you could connect up those people and make all of that expertise visible? MIT now actually does degrees in this. Okay, so I leave you with this. Everybody wants a social media strategy? Here is a social media strategy. Okay? It's sort of funny, but actually what it tries to convey is that all of these things get used in different ways and they have communities built around them. Is not just blasting out, another channel of getting information out. They each have their own kind of culture, as does journalism, right? And lastly, this is Nike's mission statement. It doesn't say, we make the best athletic wear in the world. It says, we bring inspiration and innovation to every athlete in the world, right? What they're talking about is unlocking the potential of everybody. And the biggest thing that's happened to Nike in the last 10 years is the massive 30 million strong community of people who share all of their workout data with each other. It's made huge communities. Anyway, thank you very much, and look forward to the discussion.